Um, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Tejaswini Niranjana. Um, and she's currently professor and head of Department of Cultural Studies in Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and also visiting professor with the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University in India. She's co-founder of the Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore from 2000 to 2012, and was also involved with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. She is the author of several works, including Citing Translation History, Post-structuralism and the Colonial Context, Mobilizing India, Women, Music and Migration between India and Trinidad, and the work that she'll be speaking about today, which is called Musicophilia in Mumbai, Performing Subjects and the Metropolitan Unconsciousness. Apart from these monographs, she has several other writings and edited volumes. So this talk was meant to be held last year, but unfortunately due to COVID, we had to, where Tejaswini was going to be here in person. So we couldn't manage to get here in person. So this is the next best thing. After the talk, after her presentation, there will be a short response by Mary Woods, who is a professor emerita in the Department of Architecture at Cornell University. And Mary is the author of several works about architectural education and practice, film, photography, and the built environment. A recent publication is Women Architects in India, History and of Practice in Mumbai and Delhi. And she has several other works, monographs and writings to that she has published. So let me remind you that if you have any questions or comments for the speaker or for the discussion, please type them in the queue in the Daniel, where should they type them?
In the chat.
In the chat, yes, please do that. And I hope we will have time to answer some of them. So without further ado, I'll hand over the microphone to Tejaswini.
Such a pleasure to be virtually here. At least we are sharing the same backdrop, if we're not actually going to have lunch together or dinner. So thank you for making it possible, Iftikhar, and thank you, Daniel, so kindly to reach out to me again after 1 year and make this happen. So good to be here with all of you. Let me jump right in because it's a short evening for me. What I'm doing here in my book is that I trace the role of Hindustani classical music in the evolution of the city of Mumbai during the British colonial period and after independence, during what I've called the long 20th century. It's because it actually begins in the late 19th and comes into the present in the early 21st. So it's a long 20th century I'm talking about. The question I focus on is why, when Indians were becoming part of the modern world, were they obsessed with this so-called old-time music? As Indians struggled for freedom from colonial rule, they claimed older cultural forms, such as traditional music, and repurposed them into classical forms. They presented these repurposed cultural forms as national forms, connected to the new Indian identity. This identity was neither smooth nor seamless, as the contestations over music reveal. I'll show you a few images now and speak to them. Give me a second while I find the share screen. There we are. I think you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm unable to move. Okay. There we go. So this is the image I want you to look at. I just want to also show you, if you can see my book. Oops. Yeah, it's coming through the virtual, whatever. Yeah, sorry, that's the cover of my book, which you would have seen on the poster. And this image is an old postcard from which was part of the colonial circulation of images. The photograph was taken in Bombay, the postcard was printed in Luxembourg, and it circulated widely across the British Empire. I imagine that the woman on the right, as you look at the screen, is a Devadasi or a Naikin, who is who later became part of the entertaining uh, class in Goa and has moved from Goa in Western India to Bombay to learn Hindustani music from the great ustads who were also migrating to Bombay at the time. Uh, Again, in my imagination, the woman on the left is a Tawaif. She is dressed like one, a courtesan from the Mughal, the sub-courts of the Mughal Empire that were dissolving, especially after the fall of Awadh in 1857. And having lost their livelihood, many entertainers like her, managed to come down to the urban areas like in Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, to find new forms of patronage and to find another place where they could uh, be people who are practitioners of different kinds of Indian music and dance. So here you have these two women exchanging notes. Uh, Give me 1 second to just find my notes here. Um, I also imagine that the two women lived near Kennedy Bridge in the Grant Road, Lamington Road area in Bombay, where so many from their communities had made a home. So both the Naikin and from Goa and the Tawai from northern India are part of the influx of performers into the city's entertainment industry from the 1860s on. Both had an intimate connection to Hindustani music. Both were responsible for its being perpetuated in Bombay city, but very little public trace of either remains today. I will show you now another image. This image is also the image on my book cover. It has been designed by Jugal Modi, a young designer from Bombay. He did this for my exhibition, Making Music, Making Space, which took place in 2015, and which was a collaboration with architects, with designers, and with a filmmaker. In this image, you have the two women still together, now joined at the hip, but really facing away from each other. And this is how they've also disappeared in the larger musical landscape of Mumbai. But you have the Tawaif spinning a disc. You have, in many ways, these two figures brought into the present, where they exist but are invisible. In my next picture, uh, this is a space that the Tawaifs still live in today. It's very much in existence, and it's near Grant Road, near the bridge that I spoke about. Um, Here's a picture. I'll just go through these images very quickly so we can get into the rest of the talk after that. Here's a picture of a largely male audience, which is pretty much how it was until much later in the 20th century. Here is a picture of a music club where people used to meet to listen to Hindustani music. It's called Trimurti Sangeet Mandal, or Trinity Club, as it was more commonly known in English. And it's for members only, as they say. And member didn't have to pay any money. A member was just someone who showed up all the time, as the trustee, who's still alive, told us. This is from 1907, so it's a pretty old institution. This is the inside of Trinity Club, where you see pictures of some of the greatest singers in Hindustani music. There are also major women singers, Kesarbai Kerkar, Gauharbai, and they're on the other side of this image. Here's another space. The reason to show you these different kinds of spaces is to remark on the diversity of spaces that music occupied, especially Hindustani music in Mumbai. Here is an Irani restaurant, and it still exists. It was still there from the early 20th century. And here is where, after a night of listening to music, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, going from music club to music club, concert hall to concert hall, people would gather in the early morning as the restaurant opened to have tea and discuss the merits of the singers they had been listening to all night. Here is Bhangwadi, also in the neighborhood of Girgam, the native town of Bombay. And here is where you used to have Gujarati plays. And much of the music in these plays also based on the melodies of Hindustani music. Here's Royal Opera House, which is sort of in a liminal space between the native town and the fort area, which was the colonial area in Bombay. And this had from the earliest times also had Hindustani music performances along with musical reviews from England or proscenium plays of different kinds and different languages. Here's a high school auditorium. And here too, this was like a very famous venue for music concerts throughout the 20th century. Here you have another kind of building. This is from 1831. Um, so the tank was built in 1831, and on top of the tank, Farabji Kawasji built through public donations. It was built in his memory in 1853, and this still exists. It's a public library. As you can see, they're also selling, Reebok and shoes of different kinds, but it actually still functions as a public space in Mumbai. And at the time in the 1860s was a major venue for Hindustani music concerts. Here is a very rundown ramshackle building, which most likely is where Tawaifs and Naikins lived in those days, very much near again the Kennedy Bridge area. Here again in the same area in Ketwadi are some of the theaters which in those days had musical plays and today are just running sort of C grade movies from the Hindi cinema. Another very famous, possibly from 1914, early 20th century theater. This is Lakshmi Bagh, and in the clip I will show you towards the end of my talk, you will see this major concert hall again. And here is my last slide, is Devdar School of Indian Music, founded 1925 by B.R. Devdar, again, a very famous teacher, pedagogue, musician, someone who was institutionally a very important person for the perpetuation of Hindustani music in Mumbai. So let me stop this and go back to my notes. So this assortment of images showed you different kinds of spaces to do with music. There are spaces of performance, spaces where people live, spaces where teaching is done. There's sometimes no clear distinction between the three kinds of spaces. The same space is used for all three purposes: living, teaching, and performing. And all of these spaces, as I mentioned, are in the native town of Girgam. The rest of the Indians lived in the native town, whereas the elite Indians and the Europeans lived in the fort area. I won't say anything more about the slides for lack of time, but I will just jump to my next proposition. Central to my book is a phenomenon of musicophilia and the people madly in love with music, the musicophiliacs, or diwane, as we would call them. Who were they? Where did they come from? How did their aspirations in the modern city of Mumbai become linked to the appreciation of Hindustani music? Where did Mumbai people get exposed to this music? And what might have been their experience of collective listening? What sense of the public did the listening experience generate? If indeed listening was a deeply felt, individualized experience at the same time that it was a collective one, can we call this listening individual a social subject? In my book, I call the social subject the musicophiliac, the one who's madly in love with music, a subject formed through collective listening. So Divanapan is a condition of subjective excess, the condition of the musical subject's simultaneous psychic and social habitation of modern urban space. And this modern urban space of Bombay, Mumbai, for those of you who don't know it, was quite distinctive. It was second largest city in the British Empire. From having been a minor outpost of the empire, rented out to the East India Company at £10 per annum, by 1800, Mumbai saw the rapid growth of the opium trade with China. Shipbuilders and merchants moved to Bombay. They came from heterogeneous group, including Parsis, Gujarati Baniyas, Marathi speakers, Marwadis, Boras, Armenians, and Indo-Portuguese. The East India Company, which administered the city, encouraged a variety of artisans to migrate from the Marathi-speaking hinterland, as well as from the Konkan coast and from Gujarat. And with the numerous petty traders, these became the inhabitants of the native town in the 1800s. Later in the century, this native town also became home to the new middle class professionals and to musicians and performers of different kinds. By the early 20th century, Bombay, as headquarters of the Bombay Presidency, displayed many of the features of other imperial cities of the time. It had a city planning and governing authority, a judiciary, a form of political representation through institutions like the municipal council, a local bourgeoisie, a major commercial and industrial sector, an entertainment industry, hospitals, professional schools, an elaborate education system ranging from primary to tertiary levels, and a multi-language and vocal press. Aspects of Mumbai's modernity could be seen in new structures of governance and new associational models, even those which brought people together on the basis of caste, place of origin, and language. There were platforms on which participants deliberated on issues of common good and spoke on behalf of constituencies they claimed to represent. But alongside these platforms, there were others, like those that brought musicophiliacs together, which did not necessarily function as a space of or for representation. In spite of the efforts of music critics to deploy classificatory systems and popularize standards of judgment, evidenced in sporadic debates in magazines, musicophiliacs were not bound to follow principles of rational discourse. Instead, the space they occupied while listening to music was one of intense and vociferous expression of appreciation and devotion. Often it was a space in which people felt silent because they were so profoundly moved, and where head shaking or swaying or weeping, marks of what we might call bodies in affect, were greatly in evidence. In order to be able to understand the musicophiliac as a subject embedded in colonial and post-colonial modernity, we need to grasp this subject as a social subject and not an individual in the normative Euro-modern sense. I'll jump now to another key concept of my book, which is the Metropolitan unconscious. I claim that in the city, there obtains what I call this Metropolitan unconscious. This is a collectivized unconscious that includes the diverse pasts and experiences of the migrants who came to settle here under conditions of colonial modernity from the 19th century onwards. The Metropolitan unconscious draws on all these migrant histories, but is not identical with any one of them. This would include both the hereditary musicians who taught and performed here, as well as the people who made up the musicophiliac audience. Internally fraught by divisions of caste, class, religion, gender, and language, the musicophiliacs, fixated on Hindustani music, could sidestep these distinctions to create a community of musical affect. It was not a matter of transcending the divisions, but of negotiating them in ways that had to be performed and not laid out in contractual language. Musicophilia represents, I argue, some features of the excess of subject formation in the contingent historical conditions of urban Bombay. And the Metropolitan unconscious then stands for the sedimented repertoire of ways of living and experiencing that people brought into Bombay and which underwent transformation in engaging with the conditions of the present. The coming together in the metropolitan space-time of colonial Bombay of multiple histories should be seen as creating not a sum of their parts, but an altogether new entity, which I have called the Metropolitan unconscious. Inhabiting this Metropolitan unconscious affords new routes and new opportunities for the formation of social subjects. So under conditions of colonial modernity and the subsequent assembling of a national modern, subjects render their present livable by re-envisioning the past. But they do so, as in the case of Hindustani music, by drawing on a shared archive, not an individuated one. Even as they engage in personal quests for listening opportunities, in building a vocabulary of devotion around their favorite musician, or in attempting to learn to sing or play an instrument themselves. I propose that the performance of modernity was an imperative of this metropolitan unconscious, and that the passion for music opened up an important route to the realization of this performance. So although the word performance in contemporary English indicates the act of presenting a play or any other form of entertainment, or at the most may refer to doing a particular job or undertaking an activity, in most Indian languages, the word for performance, which is pradarshan, refers to enactment and exhibition on the one hand, and to demonstration or showing on the other. Drawing heavily on the connotations of pradarshan, then, in this book, I use its translation, performance, to mean render articulate, make visible, display, or demonstrate. So in the period I'm looking at, Hindustani music moved from being a courtly art to one firmly embedded in the urban marketplace. New structures of patronage for performers included the music theatre companies, the emerging middle classes who set up music circles, the gramophone companies, and the state-owned radio. The new audiences for this music formed communities of listeners who, as I said, often try to learn music themselves through the burgeoning music schools or through individual discipleship to great musicians. I argue that in Bombay, the centrality of music from the late 19th century onwards helped to form a distinctive urbanity, manifested in how urban spaces were organized and how they were experienced by musical subjects. Significantly, there was no dominant community in the city, historically speaking, culturally dominant community, and no dominant language, since it was populated by speakers of Marathi, although they were of a sizable number, of Gujarati, who were Hindu, Muslim, or Parsi by religious affiliation, Konkani speakers, Hindustani, Urdu speakers, speakers of Telugu and other South Indian languages, and also Christians who spoke English and other languages, Baghdadi Jews who spoke a dialect of Arabic, and again, many, many other languages. The linguistic diversity of Bombay's inhabitants is relevant to my argument about musicophilia in the city. I'll demonstrate that in a minute, but first a short detour through theatre history. From the 1860s on, when the first proscenium theatres were built, the urban experience in Bombay included the entertainment afforded by the musical play. The history of the musical theatre in Bombay is closely tied to the 19th century emergence and growing popularity of Hindustani music. Whether it was in the Parsi theatre, which was first in Gujarati and then in Hindustani or Urdu, or the Marathi language in the Sangeet Natak, audiences encountered melodies from art music, especially through lighter genres like the Dadra, the Hori, the Ghazal, Qawwali, and Tumri. While the Parsi theatre or the Sangeet Natak did not usually provide a performance platform for classical music per se, the songs, often numbering more than 60 or 70 songs per play, were raga based, both Hindustani and Carnatic. And this helped to cultivate a taste for the melodic forms of such raga music in the theatre audiences. Several musicians were closely associated with the theatre as trainers, composers, actors, and even directors. So the significance of the theatre's intimate connection to Hindustani raga music can't be emphasized enough for my argument about musicophilia and the performance of modernity. Um, so in the early days, in the 1860s, people like Vishnudas Bhave put up plays in both Marathi and Hindi, but in later decades, this form of theatre confined itself to Marathi only, even as the melodic basis of the music they became famous for remained the Hindustani music originally taught by the migrant Muslim ustads. When the talkies in Hindi and Marathi started being made in the 1930s, well-known musicians like Master Krishna Rao composed for the films and also sang for them. So the popularity of the Parsi theatre and the Sangeet Natak over nearly 7 or 8 decades helped to cultivate a musical literacy, not only in the theatre-going audience, but also in those who listened to the stage songs over the radio, even after the theatre itself had begun to decline. So in some ways, you can say that the widespread appreciation of stage music was one of the factors contributing to the clamor for learning Hindustani music that arose in Bombay in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. I won't go into who these students were. Maybe if there's time, I could talk about this a little more after that. I just want to rush through the rest of my presentation here to put forward another concept that I've proposed in my book, which is the lingua musica. I draw here on the work of Catherine Hansen, that all of you would know her very insightful work on Parsi theatre in particular. As she points out, Urdu and or Hindustani was not the first language of many Bombay residents in the late 19th century. Knowledge of Urdu was lacking among playwrights, actors, and spectators when the language was first introduced on stage. Hansen argues that the circulation of linguistic forms through popular media enables the configuration of linguistic identities. And this is a really brilliant insight. But I would want to extend that beyond the domain of popular culture, whether it's the 19th century theater or the 20th century Bombay cinema. And I'll modify the insight a bit to bring it into my story of Hindustani music and the Metropolitan unconscious. I would want to argue that it's precisely the circulation and normativization of Hindustani musical compositions that allow linguistic preferences to be layered. So that a person engaging with raga music in Bombay, whether in the 19th century or the present, moves constantly between languages in daily interaction, but privileges Hindustani, which includes all its dialects, privileges Hindustani compositions. It was common in the music schools of Gwalior, Baroda, Lucknow, and Bombay in the early 20th century to have instructors speaking in Marathi to get students to sing in Hindustani. So this could, of course, be an indication that most of the people who thronged the music schools were either native speakers of Marathi or were fluent in that language, like Konkani or Kannada speakers from the Bombay Presidency region. So, but let me extend this idea of moving between languages in the engagement with Hindustani music to suggest that one reason why some form of Hindustani becomes the main mode of communication in Bombay and remains so to this day is precisely because it is underlaid with the lingua musica, which had become part of the cultural vernacular of the city by the early 20th century. This is highly speculative, but I think in the larger context of my argument, it makes sense. Musicophiliacs encountered the expressive forms of the lingua musica through their experience as theater goers, as concert goers, and as students in music classes. It would be the same cultural idiom that they would meet in its refraction through the music of Hindi films. As I try to conclude, a word now about how I conducted the research. I'd like to use the term multimodal methods to refer to both how the research was conducted and how its findings are represented. The research was carried out through a sustained engagement with practice as well as practitioners. Here you'll find multiple layers of practice. You have the musical practice that I shared with my musicophiliac subjects, being myself an amateur practitioner of Hindustani music. The filmmaker's practice, which I shared in as co-producer and conceptualizer of the film, you'll see a bit of that towards the end. The architect's practice, my two colleagues, my architect friends, who opened up the space of Mumbai's native town for me as I walked with them through the streets. And the practice of the exhibition designer, in conversation with whom I curated the Making Music, Making Space exhibition in 2015. The actual writing up of the book followed on the heels of these different engagements with practice. In 2011, I was already learning Hindustani music in Mumbai. And when I thought of this project, I approached my filmmaker friend, Surabhi Sharma, and said that unlike in our last project, which was on Caribbean music, this time we'll begin with the film. We'll do the research and the film together, and hopefully one will impact the other in significant ways. I think this is an important part of the methodology. It's not simply an academic project where I say, I'll work on this topic, here's my archive, here are my texts, and I will then write about it. Neither is it a conventional ethnography, it certainly isn't, since it has a lot to do with how one engages with practitioners of various kinds. So I'll return to my proposition about a multimodal methodology. Not only does a project deal with different kinds of materials, it also speaks to very diverse audiences. And I think this kind of public engagement is crucial for me for testing the gravity of the questions that I'm trying to ask. So I curated an exhibition, we produced a film, and there's the book. And all of these are aspects of the project, but not one of them is supplementary to the other. They all work together to create a collective endeavor of trying to explore this question of space and music in Mumbai, and of rendering what it means to be mad about music. So at the end, I'll play you a small clip. It's about 5 minutes from Fir Se Sam Pe Aana, Returning to the First Beat, directed by Surabhi Sharma, produced by me. And here you can catch glimpses of the spaces of music I talk about in my book, and a glimpse of a young singer who features also in my current project, which I'm happy to talk about if someone has a question for me. I will give me a minute to share screen and I will play you the clip. Sorry, I think it would take too much time to play the whole clip, so I'm going to stop here. I know Mary has some comments, and I'm happy to answer questions if we can manage the time.
I'm sure we will. And thank you so much for a marvelous presentation. And thank you for your book. It's on order, but I've only been able to read the online first portion of it. But thank you again. And I must say, this could become habit forming to have a lecture in the morning. I know it's evening time for you. So I want to thank you again, but what a lovely way to start with music again. So thank you. I have to say, as someone who deals with the architecture and the urban fabric of the city, I'm so impressed with your weaving together of a multi-sensorial city for us, and how you have embodied both in your book, your work, and your process such a rich approach. And the other thing I so admire about the book and also your presentation is the way in which you're able to weave together the scholarly. It's an incredibly rigorous book in terms of history and theory, but also the personal. And that begins very much in your introduction, which I so enjoyed. It's very warm, humorous, and also touching. And I think we get a sense of that from the title, On Not Being Able to Learn Music, where you speak about your own struggles throughout your life in learning music, different kinds of music that influenced you. So I'm sure the book will be and is already a great success. But I wanted to ask you about this very rich ecosystem that you have woven, as I said, that is multi-sensorial. And as you pointed out, Hindustani classical music really does move from the spaces, the precincts of the courtly into an urban market and a mass market. But I was wondering, since its audiences and its performers are still divided by class and caste and language and ethnic group, many are migrants coming to the city of gold, Bombay. How did that play out in terms of the public and private spaces that they inhabited or didn't inhabit together?
This is always a difficult question because of the sheer lack of empirical information about which would allow us to finally differentiate what the audiences were like. So there's a lot of speculation, right? And one can, but I don't have time for a comprehensive answer. But interestingly, the audiences which went to the theater were far more diverse than you imagine. So they would be also depending on the price of the tickets and where they would sit. So even though they were not maybe the audiences that went to listen to concert halls to listen to Hindustani music, they would know the melodies of Hindustani music through the theater, right? And also when you had the Ganesh Utsav or the Ganesh festival, for those who don't know it, which is became a very big political issue after the 19th century and became an occasion for Indians to have a large public procession using the figure, the god, Hindu god Ganesh. And around the Ganesh Utsav, there were always Hindustani music concerts. So basically, when you have a music that is not confined to four walls, but is leaking through the entire neighborhood, it doesn't matter who's there, they're going to hear it, whether they're listening attentively or not. So I think it's very difficult to say there's a very clearly demarcated audience by caste, class, and region. I think it's really pretty mixed.
Oh, that's wonderful. And, you know, again, I hope that we can screen your film. I think that would be fantastic. And I think the film captured that notion of leakage, that the music and the singing is not confined, because as one begins, the young woman with the headphones, but we really hear the sounds of the city. And it really made me so nostalgic and homesick for Bombay. So again, thank you so much. I'm also wondering, as you said, this really does become imbricated with new media, new technologies, along with new audiences. And since your book, as you say, it's the long 20th century. So I wonder if you could speculate in terms of the late 20th century and the early 21st century, the impact of new media, particularly social media, on these urbanites who are also audiences, but also subjects as well. I mean, I know in my own work on the cinemas and the theaters, and particularly now in the COVID era, they were already declining. And of course, cinemas all over the world because of COVID, who knows what will happen to them. So again, I'm wondering how social media might have privatized spaces or created new communities, or what you see in terms of the future of classical music and its audiences and its performing subjects.
Right. This is again a difficult question, Mary, but I'll
I'm
try
sorry.
to answer bits of it, because I would actually look at forms of online teaching as far more significant than social media in relation to what has been happening with Hindustani music in the 21st century. So, for example, I was learning music online because I was traveling a great deal in the early 21st century. And already, I think, nearly 12, 13 years ago, since I started learning music online on Skype to begin with. So when COVID happened and everyone moved completely online, and my music also stayed online, I thought it might be very easy for me to, for example, teach undergraduates online. But I realized they're not translatable because the pedagogy is quite different, right? And I think that online teaching really took off for Hindustani music and managed to get much wider audiences for it. People who could be abroad and still study, largely Indian audiences or people of South Asian descent, but not necessarily, because many others also learning online. There's a whole sub-chapter in my book towards the end. The last big chapter is about pedagogy, about Talim, and there I have a section on online teaching. So I think that might, when you get to read the book, I think that'll give you some idea of what exactly has been changing. Social media is relatively new. I mean, even the young singers I know are somewhat reluctantly on social media just to advertise their upcoming concerts, nowadays all live streamed or online or in very small spaces. Yeah. So I've been listening to and helping out by, like buying tickets for a lot of online concerts in the last couple of years. And many people do it. So I don't think they can earn a living by doing that, but they stay visible. And as and when things open up, I think they will be able to, come back into the performance space. They're already performing in small groups together. Like you need the vocalist needs the accompanist, so they're all in the same space without a mask singing. So that's a risk they have to take as performers, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So you, sorry, please go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I'm done. Yeah.
And I just wanted, before we open it up, I wanted to ask you about your current project and how, again, your experiences, your explorations in many different media in terms of your project, the book, lectures, an exhibition, a film, is that going to have an impact on your current project or not with your methods going forward? I mean, depending on the subject of that.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I won't make this again a long answer, but this is an unfolding project. I've been working for the last 4 years to bring Indian and Chinese musicians together. And because I've been based in Hong Kong, and I'll be leaving shortly, but I have spent a good 5 years here. And this has been a very important part of my exploration or non-exploration of language and my struggles with language in this region, the different languages I have to learn and cannot learn because of various other kinds of language interference. But how one then can overcome this through a lingua musica has been, I think, a project. And I've, I think, had some success in bringing together Indian vocalists with, instrumentalists playing the pipa and the yangqin in Hong Kong and China, and with a folk singer who's based in Beijing, and interestingly, a cantopop lyric writer, a poet who's a good friend of mine and who has been composing poetry in Cantonese for the Hindustani singers. So the kind of crossing off and the exploration of and the interrogation of the limits of language are very much there in my current project as well. It's called Saath Saath, which means together, together in Hindi. And it's called, please look up saathsaathmusic.com. I'll type that in the chat box. This website showcases all our projects. we have a film with the same Surabhi Sharma. We're struggling to get the film in place, and the film will be ready in 2 weeks because we are going to show bits of it in an album preview that we're having. We have 2 albums coming out, one China album, one Hong Kong album from Palmer Recordings. So it will be circulated physically in North America and virtually in the rest of the world. You can hear much of the music on the many concerts I've uploaded on the website, but the albums themselves will be available very soon. So yes, it's been, I can see a lot of continuities in terms of the multimodal methodology and some of the questions that I've taken. But one thing that is, of course, different is that what I found as the limitation of the methodological nationalism of the Mumbai project, because one is caught in trying to explain the Indian national model, right? And I felt that I was training against that. And I think this has allowed me to interrogate that from a different perspective, to be based here in East Asia.
That sounds fascinating. And I think it sounds like a wonderful reason to physically bring you to Cornell. We have a fabulous picture palace here at the Cornell Cinema. So I think it would be fantastic to have this program presented with live music and the soundtrack as well, and with you. So we can have a multimodal presentation and also have you back here. And again, I want to thank you so much for being with us. And now I think we should open it up to what I'm sure will be many questions, but I should ask you, Professor, how would you like to handle the questions? Do you want to engage with people? Do you want to use the chat box, or Iftikhar and Daniel, you're a bit more experienced with this than I am. So, but I leave it to you, Professor.
Actually, I don't mind if people would like to jump in and ask a question, but I know that we are running short of time. So I really don't mind. I don't know how much time we have. Iftikhar,
we have time. Yeah, we have time. So
I'm easy with people asking questions in person. That would be fine.
So if I may start. Okay. So thank you for your presentation, and you laid out your concepts very clearly. And of course, the book has a lot more detail that, I really encourage people to turn to the book. My question has to do with from what I understand from your presentation and your book, Bombay doesn't really have a gharana of its own, right? Because what it does is, because of its commercial flourishing, it attracts musicians from diverse, practitioners to Bombay, right? And and some of them become associated with the Parsi theater and other theaters, and then with the cinema. But then there's also these musical kind of societies. Okay, so that's so that argument would be an argument for a kind of a popular formation of what might be considered modern Hindustani music or something. Okay, so that's, on the other hand, we have the argument of people like Janaki Bakle, right, which has to do with the codification projects, the purification and codification projects, that have been undertaking. So do you want to, so can you speak more to that, that maybe the two ways of looking at how we think of Hindustani music today?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I don't want to think of it as two different ways of looking at Hindustani music, because I think that there are diverse projects that sort of flow, sometimes parallelly, sometimes in a converging way, that to do with Hindustani music. So the codifying of Hindustani music by people like Bhatkande is an important part of the story of Hindustani music in Bombay. Yeah, and there's a section in my book, I don't know if you noticed, where I talk about the different women who remain silent in the story of Hindustani music, but were supporting music and its practitioners and the codifiers from outside. So there was, a widow who was very wealthy, who gave a floor of her house to Bhatkande for him to record musicians and supported all his travels, for example. So in terms of, because my book is also about explaining if you like, the larger ecosystem within which Hindustani music takes root in Bombay, all this is part of it, as much as the Parsi theatre or the Marathi Sangeet Natak. In fact, Bhatkande learned his first exposure to Hindustani music was in the Parsi Gayan Uttejak Mandali, where it is the first institution in the 1860s, 1870 or so, to bring ustads to teach classes, Hindustani music classes on its premises. and Bharkande was first exposed to the music there. So it's very difficult to separate out these histories. They do, I think, crisscross in many different ways. Yeah.
Other questions?
If I may jump in, yeah, thank you so much for a beautiful presentation. I am curious how you are showing these imperial spaces, and I wonder what was the mixture of, say, more colonial music from England, for example, which were played, and how was the Hindustani music and maybe other musics were interacting in terms of these audiences? Were they extremely impassioned? Their musicophilia was confined to the Hindustani music, or was there enough exposure to Western musics? I'm curious about this interaction.
Right. I can see where you're speaking from. If you're from China, I think the story is very different in China, right? That there's a wholesale, in many ways, adoption of even the harmonic structures of Western music. That did not happen in India. Because of the particular history of the national modern that is often formed in opposition to and in conversation with people who's promoting Western music, right? In many ways, it is like the space that remains for the proponent of Hindustani music, the space that remains culturally Indian, in a sense. And yes, of course, and Bombay is a global city. And in those days, we didn't use the word global so easily, but it was a major imperial city. And it did, over the long 20th century, experience many, many kinds of music. One very important group would have been the jazz musicians. Like during the Second World War, African Americans would come through and they also interacted with the Goan singers who and they were very easy to teach. They learned the Western instruments. There were orchestras which played Western instruments for Hindi films, but maybe they played them differently. So I'm saying that there's no pure understanding of this is Indian music and this is not, but it's what the devotees would like to promote as Indian music. So it's not not an objective description I'm giving it. I'm just trying to see what it is that people are promoting as such. That would be one kind of answer. And of course, there were many kinds of music. There were devotional music of all kinds, Islamic, Hindu, and of other kinds. There's Christian, like church music. But even to this day, the Western music is not as dominant. Of course, in its popular forms, everyone absorbs Western music. Much of it has flowed into also Indian film music, right? But there is a different space for Hindustani music because that's remained a way by which a certain sense of the cultural identity of Indians has been held on to by the musicians themselves. So there is some effort to maintain those boundaries. So this is a major challenge for me when I brought them to China and to Hong Kong to get them to see, what it is that they were, but that's so important to the formation of their own subjectivity, this idea of this is Indian music, right? And I can see over the last 3 years how that has started to get slightly blurred. And I think that's sort of remarkable that it can happen because it doesn't usually happen in the spaces of, the listening of Hindustani music. I mean, to give you a very quick example, it's there in my book. I quote one of my teachers as saying, on any given day, there are at least 10,000 people learning Hindustani music in Bombay city. We're only talking about one city here. So it is extremely popular for all kinds of reasons. People use it also instrumentally because they feel they can get into Indian Idol or in a reality show by knowing Hindustani music. But there's a strong classical base. You can sing any kind of music once you know your classical music. So it's a messy situation. There's no only this or only that. It's like everything is in the mix.
Thank you so much.
There's a question from Mona Mehta, and
Yes.
I'll read it. For the Gujarati middle class, Bhangwadi theatre with its strong musical style was a great hit. I wonder if you discussed this in your...
Yeah, I don't discuss this in my book, Mona, so we can talk about this some other time. When you read the book, you'll see the book is in your library, Mona, by the way, my colleague from Ahmedabad University. And do take a look. It's the way it's laid out is not about particular segments of the population, but about a larger sense of musicophilia that pervaded the situation, the scene in Bombay. And the Bangwadi theater also used the melodies of Hindustani music, from what I gather. And the same kinds of people frequented that space, and also the same, not only the Gujaratis. Similarly, the performers also were not always only Gujaratis. Many of the women I talked to who were either from, Devadasi or Tawaif backgrounds also had a connection to the spaces in Bangwadi. So it was an important space, but it wasn't necessarily only linguistically or ethnically defined.
So I'm going to jump in because Iftikhar had a power cut in Ithaca and fell off. I said, if others have questions, please put them in the chat. I have one. I'm wondering about the relationship between performance and technology from the growth of 78s to then All India Radio and later to the shift where people's first exposure was to live music, but then later shifts to being recorded music. And how did that affect people's musicophilia when they?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, Daniel, that's a really interesting question, but I'm not sure the shifts are so clearly recognizable. So if you look at someone like Gangubai Hanagal, who's from my own state of Karnataka, and who was beginning to learn music in the early 20th century. She Hindustani music was among the first kinds of music in the world to be recorded for the gramophone. And Gangubai, who came from her mother sang Carnatic music, she wasn't really exposed to a lot of Hindustani music in those days. She came from a southern state. But through the records that she heard when she was a little girl in the grocery store, that of someone she knew in the early 20th century, she began to, get this fancy for Hindustani music. So someone who's seen as one of the greatest and very venerable singers of Hindustani music got her music from the records. She also got her music from the books of Bhatkande that I referred to earlier, that part of the large codification of Indian music. So while there is, of course, a discourse of the purity of pedagogy, that there is a great teacher and you learn from the teacher face to face, that's part of the discourse. It doesn't always happen like that. And I've documented many, many instances in my book of all kinds of strange situations in which people learn. So yes, the learning through records is a very, very important pedagogic mode. And it's not as though it came after the unmediated learning or unmediated listening. It was always there. What did change the way people listened and performed was a microphone. So when that became, more common, I think voice modulation, voice production, everything changed. So that would be a more remarkable thing than the gramophone records.
Oh, that's a very good point.
Someone's asking a question here.
Yeah, I can read the question from Debashri
So
Mukherjee.
I can read the question. Debashri Mukherjee. I'm afraid I cannot see Disciple here in Hong Kong. I tried to log into a New York, outlet, and it asked for my VPN. And when I tried to buy the ticket, they didn't allow me to buy the ticket. So I have not seen the film. And yes, when I've seen it, you will hear from me.
She had a longer question. She says, I'd love to hear a bit more about the formation of a popular light classical mode. Bhatkande had two disciples, the Parsi Homji sisters, who took their training and started
I can read
women.
that. I can read that, Daniel. Okay. Let me just read it quickly.
I was going to share with everyone else.
Okay.
So they started two women music assemblage for the local radio and then cinema. So I agree that this is not a straight story of codification. I'd also be curious to hear about a broader, more dispersed acoustic ecology, which ears are trained and music vocabularies are developed. And the last point is spatial history of music in Mumbai is such a wonderful project. I've been interested in speech making and oratory in early 20th century Bombay and some of the same spaces where concerts are held or where pedagogical speeches are being delivered on science, culture, etc. These spaces of association societies and salons are also multimedial spaces.
Yeah, thank you so much, Debashri. This last point is absolutely correct. And I hope you've had a chance to look at my book. I suspect you haven't. I do touch upon many of these issues there. And you're right, there are multimedia spaces. And the Blavatsky Lodge, or where the Parsi Gayana Tejak Mandali was hosted, the Safaramji Kawachi Institute. All of these people are delivering lectures on science and art, and they're also having the concerts in the same spaces. The private salon is a little bit different, but they may not have the same kinds of subjects covered. But sure, I think the multiple use of the space is something important to remember. Of course, there would be something like the School of Indian Music, which would not necessarily have lectures on science, but Devdar did engage in experiments, acoustic experiments, and that would have found a place in something like the Devdar School, which otherwise would be devoted to performance and to teaching. I think this is a nice phrase, a more dispersed acoustic ecology. Let me think about that. And I think there is some evidence of that in the way I talk about how Hindustani music is learned, which has been the focus of my book, learned and listened to. So do take a look. And I think this is, space for another conversation here around this question. But that's a lovely phrase. Thank you so much.
I encourage anybody else to, if they have a question, put that in the chat if they want to ask them. I'm sure there are many questions. And I actually just had a question. How did all your work is in Mumbai, how did it compare to other cities in India of the musical tradition, say in Calcutta, or I guess at that early in the 20th century, there wasn't much in Delhi, perhaps. What made Mumbai distinctive?
I don't know if I can answer that question because I have not studied the musical culture of Calcutta and Delhi. So the book is not interested in promoting the uniqueness of Mumbai, and it's really not part of my argument. It just becomes a space in which I can explore this question of the metropolitan unconscious and the development of musicophilia. However, I do want to suggest that, there is a book that I co-edited last year in the middle of the pandemic. It came out. It's published by OUP, and it's on music, modernity, and the public and publicness in India. And in this edited volume, I'd like to draw your attention to Adrian McNeil's work on Calcutta and Lakshmi Subramaniam's work on Chennai, which in different ways are talking about emergent musical cultures. I always say to them, and we haven't met in a very long time, partly because of distance, partly the pandemic, but I say to them that we need really a multi-city project of the kind that we were beginning to talk about. But there is some aspects of that are to be found in that edited volume.
Okay. I see that Iftikhar has joined us again. His power is back in Ithaca.
I don't see him. Is he here?
Yeah.
Okay. There.
So are there other questions or comments?
I don't know if anyone else has another question, but perhaps if it's all right, I can ask another question. Given how wonderfully you've painted how classical music really pervaded physical and sound spaces throughout Bombay, Mumbai, were there certain purists of the Hindustani classical tradition who were somewhat upset by this or took umbrage at it? A bit like the cosmopolitan nature of Bombay itself, Mumbai itself.
Right. Again, my book is not really a historical book, and I haven't done the kind of work that would help me answer the question that you're asking. Because I'm really looking at music and the certain concepts and questions as they unfold, and I'm trying to provide a new interpretive frame. I'm not a historian. I have not done that kind of work. However, I think that it's important to point out again that the idea of objecting and purism, etc., is also a particular kind of discourse. Yes. And when you're in the urban marketplace, the earliest musicians from the imperial courts were figuring out how to have ticketed concerts. I think that when your livelihood is at stake, and when I think some of them were so adventurous and they were jumping into these new spaces of figuring out how to have new audiences, I don't think anyone had the time to be pure. And I think it's really in later times when people can afford to treat this as a historical phenomenon frozen in time, which I think is also really inaccurate. This is a modern form. It's not, people say, oh, it is 1,000 years old, whatever. But still, you can see it changing in every decade, in every century changes because of the way it's performed, because of the repertoire, because of the technology and all kinds of other reasons. So I think that people who have the luxury to say, oh, this is very pure and objective to being played in some other context or sung in another context are only the ones who are really not the practitioners.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
If I may ask one more question. Sure. I'm curious about the dynamic of your current project in Hong Kong, bringing together Hindustani and Chinese music making. And you hinted at it a little earlier when you said maybe that the Hindustani conception of their music is maybe more closely framed as a category. And I wonder what is the Chinese traditional music, the musicians' approach to this collaboration and the perforation of these musical boundaries?
I think you really should listen to the tracks. Do catch some of the concerts that you will find. I've shared the music website. I think, again, so much has to do with serendipity, so much has to do with people that one finds. And it was quite difficult for me. I don't speak, except for a few words of Mandarin and Cantonese, I don't really speak these languages. And it's really hard. I find these the most difficult languages in the world to learn. But like I said, it's through music one is managing to, get past some of these hurdles, and through using bits of English, through using translators and so on. And with all of this, we found that instrumental music, so the pipa and the yangqin are the instruments we found. Yangqin has in many ways a history with, the santur, for example. So my colleague Ip Kim Ho, who plays the yangqin for our project, when he came to India 2 years ago, he said, I will play the santur. I'm not carrying my yangqin, it's too big, but I will learn to play the santur because he's the great grandfather of the yangqin, right? And all of it came from West Asia anyway, to say it rather crudely. So in a sense, what people are proclaiming as an Indian instrument, a Chinese instrument, I mean, it's clearly the, the ambitions of nation states, the ambitions of particular forms of national modernity, which give them these names. I mean, it's just a musical instrument. So I think it is sometimes difficult for both musicians and audiences to accept this lack of pure identity of the instrument in the voice, and especially in relation to Hindustani music, which has had in its current practitioners, and my collaborators are all quite young. They're about 30, a little over 30 or a little under 30. And they have been trained in this idea that this is a great tradition that we are carrying forward, and this is our mission to take Indian music to the uncivilized world, if you like, right? And I think you had some of that ambition when they came and said, we are going to teach Chinese musicians Indian music. And I think that ambition would have been there, but I think it fell apart very quickly because it's clear that, and as our Chinese instrument players said, they said, these are Chinese instruments. We cannot play Hindustani music because there's always the note did not match and the scales were not able to be played. So there's a lot of discussion of that in our documentary film. I think you might enjoy it when it comes out, right? So the actual difficulties of collaboration is what the film is about, not the successes. The successes you will hear when you listen to the albums, because we did manage to make some good music. Right. So I think the challenging of these boundaries and performing or collaborating, working with the musics at the limits is what everyone tried to do, whether they were speaking from the Chinese side or the Indian side.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will definitely go find this movie and watch it. Yeah.
The movie isn't out yet. It'll be in a few months, but do look at the website and we will keep you updated about its progress.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So if there are no more questions, then I would like to please join me in thanking Tejaswini Niranjana for her presentation, and thanks to all of you for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation. And thank you, Mary. Thank you, Iftikhar, Daniel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.